Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Extracting More Value from Your Data Part 1, Leveraging Location Intelligence. My name's Sue. I'm your event manager. During the presentation, your lines will remain on listen only. If you need assistance at any stage, please key *0 on your phone and an operator will be happy to assist you. I'd like to advise all parties the conference is being recorded, and now I'd like to hand over to your host, Scott Hartzell. Please go ahead, Scott.
Thank you, Sue. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate all of you spending a little time with us on our webinar series. Today we have a presentation from Tim Ultee with Parsons. He is going to be delivering the first of a two-part series on extracting more value from your data. His part will cover leveraging location intelligence. A few of our standard housekeeping items here. As you heard, your lines will be on mute right now. You can ask questions using the Q&A function within WebEx, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the call when we will cover as many as we can, and we will return messages to people if we have more questions than we can handle at that time. A brief agenda. We're going to give you a little bit of an introduction into Tim, and he will give a core value moment, his presentation, and as mentioned, we'll try to save 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the call for questions and answers. So Tim is a senior GIS professional with Parsons. He does work in GPS surveying, managing geospatial databases, spatial analysis, mobile data collection. He also does have his remote pilot license and supports unmanned aircraft systems or drones, and all of that will come into play in what he's about to present. So without any further ado, we'll turn it over to Tim.
All right, thanks a lot, Scott. All right, so first to get started, as is customary here at Parsons, we like to start any meeting or conference with a core value moment where we highlight one of Parsons' core values. So today I'd like to talk about the core value of safety. And the specific aspect I want to discuss is the importance of identifying and reporting hazards. So a hazard is something that has the potential to cause an incident. And identifying hazards is an integral part of any safety program and really just going about your life in a safe manner. You don't want to wait for incidents to happen. You want to identify hazards, things that could potentially cause an injury or cause an incident before they happen. But just as important as identifying a hazard is reporting it and communicating it effectively to others. And so an example of this that happened on one of the sites I work at a couple of years ago, I was out GPS surveying and saw a sharp piece of rebar sticking up maybe a few inches out of the ground. It was rusted, very easy to miss on brown soil. I didn't step on it. I didn't nearly step on it. So it wasn't what we in safety culture call a near miss or an incident, but it was clearly a hazard. So I could have just gone about my business and said, oh, good thing I didn't step on that. But makes it that much more likely that someone else will come along and potentially step on it, maybe penetrate their boot or trip on it. And so in addition to reporting near misses and incidents at Parsons, we ensure to report HAZ-IDs, we call them, or hazard identifications, and so that they can be hopefully at least corrected, or at the very least mitigated, if not outright corrected. So in that case, you might just have that piece of rebar removed from the ground or cut at the ground surface. And this applies to your own life as well. With a lot of us working from home these days, with your family, you might be in your yard and see like a pit, in say your backyard, a sudden sinkhole that you could easily twist an ankle in. Yes, it's important that you don't step in it, but it's just as important that you alert anyone else who may be walking in the area, other family members, other people who would go through there. So make sure that they don't step in it as well, and optimally fix the issue. So either make it very noticeable, fill it in, something like that. So it's really the importance of sharing what you observe with others so that we can all be a little safer. With that, going to begin. So this is part one of a two-part series on extracting more value from your data. Today I'm going to be focusing on leveraging location intelligence. So how can we use innovations in location technology to allow ourselves to work better, more efficiently, and safer? So first, why does location matter? Why are you all here? Well, first of all, location technology allows you to accurately translate plans to implementation. So you can spend a lot of time in your office, say, planning a sampling plan or planning an implementation, an excavation, injection points, whatever it may be, and you can be incredibly precise with your plans, whether it's in CAD or GIS or some other software. But if you can't accurately translate those to the field, you really lose a lot of the value of all that precision and time you spent making very accurate plans. So having location technology, deployed at your site allows you to ensure that what you're planning is actually what is being implemented. You're also empowering field crews with location information, both to collect information more easily for them, but also to give them more information at their fingertips, generally on devices where they can see not only what they can visually see around them, but they can get information on things that may not be so visually obvious, say where a soil boring was located that was drilled 4 years ago, or where a subsurface utility may be before a field team decides to drill. You can really empower your field crews with a lot of the information as if they were sitting in the office with access to your databases, but while in the field. Layering location data improves situational awareness. So one of the most integral parts of a geospatial system, I'll also just use the word GIS interchangeably often, is that you can layer information from many different sources together. So you can have your sample locations, you can also have utilities, you might also have groundwater flows, surface elevation. You can really take information from a lot of different sources and improve your understanding of the whole site as you plan your work. And lastly, the idea of seeing what others don't. So there's so much more that you can see on a map, and especially when you use geoprocessing tools to do analysis of your data, that's just not really visible if you're looking at tables, or just raw data. You can patterns that otherwise would not have been visible or would not have really made much sense can really stand out very immediately when you apply geoprocessing tools to them. So before I jump into the innovations, I'm going to talk about what it's like working without location innovations. What is kind of the status quo at a lot of sites. First, paper maps and forms. So paper forms, they're error prone. You're kind of reading people's handwriting. They get lost. They're messy. They might get dirty. There's a lot of, there's reasons that we, of course, use paper forms in the past, but there's a lot of labor and potential errors that come into using paper forms that there are ways to address that with newer technology. And the same goes for paper maps. So you might have a map produced and printed out, folded up in a truck, with your field team as they go out to a location. But the paper map is very limited in how it was initially designed. So if a field team wants to go outside of the extent of the map, they either need another map or they're just working without a map. Or if they see a feature on that map, say a monitoring well, and they want to know, well, how deep is this well? When was this last gauged? You can't click on that point on a paper map and you're just limited to what's on that map. It's not interactive in any way. Another thing a lot of sites have is a wealth of institutional knowledge locked up in individuals, what some people call the hit by a bus scenario. So you might have an individual who's been on your site 5, 10, even 15 years, and they know just where everything is. They've got it all mapped out in their head, and, oh, how do we access this difficult to reach well? Oh, well, Mark knows. Well, what happens if Mark's on PTO? What happens if Mark retires? Well, then no one really knows how to get to that well. We'll figure it out, I guess, when we get to that point. By building a spatial system, by having a lot of these new innovations deployed, you can take that information and take all the value it represents, but instead of being locked up in a few individuals, you can make it accessible to everyone. You also have traditional surveys, very valuable to get, a very precise and accurate survey, but they're very labor intensive and they're very costly. So it limits the amount that you can use them. And so you might really want an updated survey of an area, but you don't have the time or you don't have the budget to really justify it at that time, and you end up working with maybe outdated data. You try and estimate for changes that have happened on the site, say new road was put in or something like that. having those traditional surveys, once again, valuable but limited because of their cost and time required. GIS and CAD analysts as gatekeepers. So this is a term that's often used to describe the changes that have been happening over the last 5-10 years, is that traditionally these analysts have been, the only people with direct access to your spatial data. So whether it's CAD designs, whether it's GIS, spatial databases, if you want a map, if you want a design, if you want something tweaked on those, you had to go to the analyst to get it done. You had a question, they had to look it up for you. You didn't really have any direct access to your own data. You sort of required a lot of back and forth. And lastly, you had a situation where planners really lack real-time information. One of the other problems with paper maps is that as soon as you print it, that's a time capsule in time. So you print it today, a new piece of infrastructure goes in, a week from now, none of that's captured. New sample locations are gauged or installed. None of that information is captured. You need new maps. And it's pretty common to have old maps that just seem to continue popping up on a site where someone's like, oh, well, I have this map right here. Well, that was actually produced in 2017. So it's missing a lot of the information, but they don't necessarily know that if they don't have an updated map. And so just one of the real limitations with working with traditional paper and paper maps that we work with. I just have this quote from Jack Dangerman, the president of Esri, where it kind of summarizes the changes and how people are changing the way they look at location information, where executives are waking up to realize that they can do a lot better, save money, make better decisions if they optimize and start thinking geographically and have a location strategy, which is really what this presentation is all about. So the first of 3 sections I want to cover is about collecting location. So new ways to collect spatial information and really location of all kinds from your sites. So I'm going to cover how you can use mobile devices to do this, how you can pair that with high accuracy GPS devices to get very precise and accurate data, and then how drones can be used for collecting data on sites. First, mobile devices as data collectors. One of the best things about mobile devices that are used on sites these days is that they tend to use very similar consumer products that we're all very familiar with. So instead of having some clunky, difficult to use, piece of hardware that has some software you've never used before, people require training on it, they forget how to use it. I mean, we all have phones. A lot of us have tablets. I mean, I see my 2-year-old nephew browses the iPad as effectively as I do these days. And the nice thing about that is that they're very intuitive. People just seem to be able to figure them out, even crossing platforms. You jump from Android to Apple or vice versa, you can still usually figure it out. They have the benefit of requiring very little training to deploy these in a field. And when you pair that with customizable forms and maps. So one of the best things about having electronic forms, it's not just taking the exact same paper form that you always use and just throwing it into a digital format. The power of that is being able to make it a smart form, where you have things that, say, automatically fill in based on selections that the user has made. Maybe you have a whole section of the form that doesn't even appear if they don't select one option, where, why waste a ton of time and scrolling or traditionally on a piece of paper, a lot of space on, say, incident reporting if no incident was reported. So you can just have drop-down boxes that, disappear or appear as needed. And even better for data integrity and quality, you can have things like valid values and, set choices, domains of values. So for instance, on the picture there, you see different options for soil types or lithography. So instead of just having people put in whatever they want, and some people spell, gray this way, some people spell gray that way, neither is really wrong, but you want it to be consistent. You want people to use a set list so that it's much easier to digest your data and analyze it later. And same thing for valid values. You don't want someone to be able to put in a pH of 15. It's not possible. So, and you can even have things like warnings that maybe it's a possible value, but it's something that's not likely. So you can have these forms aware of previous, say, gaugings of this well. And if all 3 previous gaugings have been around 12 feet and the user tries to put in 17 feet, it's not impossible. Well, it may be impossible, but it's not necessarily impossible, but it's definitely strange. And it's something where you'd want to have, a warning pop up to the user so that they can maybe double check their work. And so it really improves the quality of the data that you're taking into your system. Compared with that is the ability to capture photos and location data with the device that you're using already. And not just with the same device, but often within the same app or form. So whereas right now, if you're using paper, you might have someone take a a photo of, a well location or an object of interest with their phone, but then that picture goes and, you have to go track it down. It's in Todd's phone. You have to go track that stuff down. This allows you to have that photo taken within the device, within the app that you're actually using, and then uploaded with the data. So it's paired with the data that they're collecting. It makes it much better for data organization. It makes it much easier for users to pull up that data later so that it really adds value. And last, just can't highlight enough the value of eliminating paper forms whenever possible. You don't have handwriting to decipher. Can't say how many times I've pulled someone over to my desk. Can you read this? Because I can't, or does that look like an A? You don't have time-consuming transcription into a database. You have someone writing the data, and then you have to have someone else sit there and copy the data into a database, as opposed to just having it go directly into the database from the form. And then a lot of these papers need to be saved for X number of years on a lot of our sites. You have to find a place to store that. It has to be organized, and it has to be kept secure during that time. And then how do you have an organized way to get rid of it once, say, the retention period has passed? A lot of those headaches go away once you start using electronic forms. And paired very well with that is high-accuracy GPS receivers. So just one sentence of history, in the year 2000, the U.S. military stopped scrambling GPS signals. And that single decision effectively kickstarted a spatial revolution, where before you could get really terrible accuracy with most GPS devices. Basically, with the throw of a switch, they allowed all of us to get the level of accuracy that we get on our phones all the time, to the point that we now all have GPS devices in our pockets, a lot of us on our wrists, in our vehicles, and really all sorts of other places. And some of you may remember 4 years ago when all of a sudden there was an explosion of people in all your nearby parks looking at their phones, walking around, walking into trees. That was the introduction of Pokemon Go. And games like Pokemon Go and other games and apps like it, none of that would be possible without the high-accuracy GPS, signals that we all receive from these various devices. And there's new active constellations being put up by different countries every year. You have one for Europe, you have one in China, you have Russia, US, and by using different constellations together, you can get even higher levels of accuracy, to the point where now you can get GPS units that can achieve really centimeter and even sub-centimeter accuracy when using real-time correction. And they can achieve that accuracy pretty quickly and at much lower cost than you would have gotten even 10 years ago, and let alone 20 or 30 years ago. And one of the coolest innovations that happened in the last, say, 10 years or so is the introduction of Bluetooth GPS devices. So traditionally, these, survey grade or mapping grade GPS devices were all in one devices. So you had the interface, the software, everything was on that one device. That meant you had to know how to use that device. It used specific software designed only for that device that you knew how to use. If you switched devices, you had to learn a whole new software. It just made it very difficult and kind of a barrier to entry for using these devices. But what the Bluetooth devices allow you to do is they give you that same survey grade level signal, but they allow you to pair it with whatever device you want. So you can be using an iPad or an iPhone or an Android tablet and get the same accuracy that you would get with that all-in-one survey-grade device. But now you have a very easy-to-use interface, and you can choose what app and mapping program really best fits your specific needs. We have a good example of a project that just started deploying this technology, where they had a near miss where a team drilled a location that they thought was pre-cleared and was not. It was very near the location that was actually pre-drilled. The one they drilled had not been successfully pre-cleared. So the client came to Parsons, wanting us to develop a solution. And so our solution was a combination of using mobile devices and GPS receivers. So not only did we replace a lot of their paper forms with mobile devices so that they can have all the benefits that grants, but just in terms of data quality, but you can also have pictures captured. So within that form, within that app, they can capture a picture of the exact location that was, successfully pre-cleared, so that the drill team, when they show up, can compare and make sure that it matches, and pair that with a high accuracy GPS receiver that gets, say, the accuracy of 1-2 centimeters. They can know with much more certainty that they're standing on the correct location, and, don't substantially reduce the risk of having a line hit or something of the like by drilling in an incorrect location using the combination of these two technologies. And last, for collecting data, I want to discuss how drones can be used as data collectors. So many people know that drones are valuable for collecting photos and, say, videos of hard-to-reach areas or getting angles that just wouldn't be possible to get from the ground. And that alone has a tremendous amount of value for inspections, of infrastructure and getting a good perspective of your site that you couldn't really get just standing on the ground. But drones also have a lot of value as analytical data collectors and location data collectors, because each photo that's collected from a drone has a GPS tag associated with it. So this image you see up top, it basically looks like a picture, but it's actually not. It's a screenshot of a point cloud. So every pixel you see in that image is a known XYZ location that can be analyzed. You can spin around, you can do volumetrics on that, and you can see in the animation down below that that's basically as you're spinning around the point cloud. So it's much more interactive. There's a lot more data embedded in it than, say, just taking a simple picture. And one of my things about drones is that their low cost enables them to be flown regularly. So whereas I talked about the traditional surveys being quite expensive and therefore somewhat limited in how often you can use them, a lot of this information can be collected in a very short amount of time. So this is a short video I have of the outputs of a drone survey I flew last September for one of our projects, and it's kind of just demonstrates the various things you get for a simple drone survey, where you get very high accuracy or high resolution imagery, much better than you can get from a satellite, and generally better than you can get from a plane as well, because you're just flying so much closer to the ground. You get elevation data for your area, so you know the elevation of each kind of grid point across your area, and that allows you to do the measurements that I was talking about. So, of course, you can measure distances and areas and things like that, but because it's embedded with 3D information, basically elevation data, you can also calculate things like volume. You can calculate cut volume, fill volume, things like that, just with the location that you get from the drone survey. And all of this was collected from a actually it wasn't even quite 20 minutes, from basically a 20-minute drone flight. So very short amount of time, and collecting over areas that might be more difficult or dangerous to get via traditional terrestrial survey, where you're kind of climbing up and down slopes and hills and uneven ground. Here you're just flying over it, so you really eliminate a lot of those safety concerns. And you can measure things like, slope and such like that because it is an interactive 3D model that you have of your whole site. So next I want to talk about analyzing and visualizing location. So first, one of the most powerful things about GIS or geospatial technology is the ability to layer different data sources together in a single display. So you can see that you might take utilities, features, ground slope, lithology. You can take a lot of these different data sources that each individually is kind of hard to kind of visualize how they fit together. You can put them all on a single display and make it much easier to have a better kind of situational awareness of what is on your site, and gives you much more knowledge before you go out and try and drill a location. You have a lot less back and forth of, no, we actually can't drill here because of this, or, oh, we can't drill here because of this. So in that animation, you see where you start with, say, sample locations. Just based on that, you might develop a plan, maybe do an interpolation to decide the areas of that. But once you start layering in information, say aerial imagery, see, oh, well, there's active tanks there. And you layer in your subsurface utilities, and like, oh, well, actually, there's an active electric line, so we can't excavate there either. And so it allows you to make your planned implementation much more precise at the end of the day, because you actually are using what the field team will run into when they're in the field. Instead of you planning it one way, they go out there, see that, oh, that won't work at all. We can't do that. And a lot more back and forth. It really increases efficiency a lot to have all that extra information early on during the planning phase. Next, so there's the geospatial analysis is a step above just layering information. So you maybe just have lots of information that you can put together once you've collected your location data. And that in and of itself is very valuable. But where a lot of the value really comes through is when you analyze that information to create new information. So this is a very broad category. I won't go into too much detail here, but it covers really everything from groundwater and contaminant interpolations, where you're developing contours or developing isoplex from a set number of sample locations, proximity analysis, see how close things are to, say, other locations, hazards, compliance averaging. There's cluster analyses. That's what the image is on the upper right. The bottom right is an interpolation of a bunch of known points across an area for elevation. And just some other examples from projects. On the upper left, you have an incremental sampling tool that one of our analysts, Chris O'Neill, developed, where you have this automated tool that really makes it much easier to use incremental sampling to get an unbiased representation of the site using randomly selected composite samples within irregularly spaced units across the site. So instead of just kind of picking and choosing arbitrarily where you might hit hot spots, you might hit spots with nothing, you might have spots where you took too many samples or spots with too few. This enables you to get both a randomized, because the samples collected in each unit are randomized for each area, but you're also doing it at regular intervals, kind of breaking up your site into different areas so that you can get a very unbiased but very representative look at your site. Traditionally, it's pretty labor intensive, but by basically using Python to build a tool, this is the type of solution that can now be much more easily deployed at other sites. Bottom left, you have basically an example of a sampling grid, kind of looks very much like a windrows, and can be useful where maybe you have a single point source of contamination that's spread from that source. That chart makes it much easier, or that visual makes it much easier to not only prioritize where you're going to start sampling, where you're going to start moving outward from that point source. It also makes it easier to track too as you move outwards, so you can see where your sampling is growing, where you're getting hotspots, where you're not, as you move outward from the point source. And on the right side, you have an example of an isoplet interpolation, where you have, say, groundwater samples across an area. You have some that have higher results, some that have lower results. You want to get an idea of what does the groundwater contamination or groundwater concentrations likely look like based on the number of samples I have. And that obviously is much more valuable the more samples you have. So if you have a very large site, that's where this stuff really starts paying off. But even the small sites can save you a lot of time and effort, and hopefully money too, by having a much better idea of, based on the samples you've already taken, what's the likely extent of the concentrations that you're looking at. Last, for analyzing, just want to talk briefly about modeling in 3 dimensions. So it's great to collect spatial data. It's great to analyze that spatial data. It's really even better if you can analyze that spatial data in 3 dimensions. And so these animations here give you an idea of what some of these models might look like, where you have soil borings, say, across an area. Well, just looking at a top-down map, you might get one impression of that area. But when you start modeling in 3D, it can give a very different impression of what you're looking at, because your soil borings aren't just, determined on an XY. They're determined on a Z. So how deep was the sample that you're looking at? How deep was the sample below that had a lower concentration? And by doing this, you can also factor in things like lithology, like what does the soil look like in this area? Is there, say, impenetrable barriers in this area that would stop or channel groundwater in that area? And what's the groundwater flow like across this area? You can take all of that into consideration. And one of the best things about this is that not only does it improve your understanding of the area and will improve the quality of the plans that you put into place, but it helps you communicate that understanding to others. So your client, and maybe more importantly, the regulators, because they're often the ones who have to buy into your proposed solution. And, you just kind of give them, oh, here's what I want to do based on this. Well, you kind of live or die sometimes by whether or not they say yes, as opposed to if you can hand them, cross sections of a 3D model, or better yet, the actual 3D model that they can look at, they then can really understand the site in the way that you do, and can hopefully understand that the solution that you're proposing is the best solution based on all the known information of the area modeled in all 3 dimensions. And if you want more information on 3D modeling, definitely tune into Jim Schutz's webinar next month, where he'll go into more detail on subsurface 3D modeling. And the last section I want to cover is sharing location. So you had You collected your location information, important. You analyzed your location information. Now what do you do with it? A lot of our sites are sitting on a mountain of location information that's not really being used. So you want to analyze that, but you also want to, push it out to people who can actually use it and generate value for you from all that data that you have. So that can be done by empowering field workers with the knowledge that they need to work better and more and safely. You have apps and dashboards that make this information much more readily available to users, and you can collaborate in ways that you were not able to in the past. First, empowering field teams with location. So this has a lot of value in several different areas. First of all, I just want to highlight safety. So you can ensure that your drillers and excavators at your field teams, as they're doing site walks, they have location information at their fingertips so that they're not just looking at the ground and saying, yeah, this looks good, I don't see any problems here. They can instead have the location information on their device with them and be confident that the planners had all that information at their fingertips so that they can see when they're out doing a site walk, well, yeah, there's that overhead line here, which they knew about, but this one here, maybe they didn't know about this slope, or say there's flooding in this area. We have to move this, say, soil boring. But then in the field, they can say, oh, well, I see that there's an electric line over here, but there's nothing over here. So it kind of gives them a lot more information to work safely in the field. And especially includes when you have the possibility of having this high accuracy GPS equipment hooked up to your actual equipment. And so an excellent example of that, and this blends right into quality and efficiency, we had a job a few years ago where we had an excavator working to dig out and layer soil, after a remediation, but it was in a stream, a relatively large stream, more like a brook. So essentially the operator is working underwater. And so he doesn't really, it's very hard to gauge how much soil are you putting in, how deep are you, what's the thickness of this layer that you've just laid down. So they equipped their excavator with GPS equipment and set up a base station on site. And by doing so, they were able to know much more precisely with tools equipped to the excavator how deep they were digging, how thick is this layer, because maybe you only wanted this layer to be 2 inches thick and you wanted the next layer to be 6 inches thick. Once again, incredibly difficult to do even under normal circumstances. Even in a normal pit, there's often groundwater to deal with. But especially in this case where they were working with essentially flowing water in a brook, they were able to be much more confident in the accuracy and the precision of their work. And the same applies to hooking up equipment to drill rigs, and really just having the ability for your field teams to not just collect the information, which I went over earlier, but to accurately translate the plans that your project scientists, that your geologists, whoever it may be, are designing in the office, and accurately translate that to the field and, be sure that they're implementing what the designers had in mind. So I cover the idea of giving the power of location to your teams. So this covers kind of in that first kind of how things used to be done, the idea of GIS specialists and CAD analysts being the gatekeepers of data. And the idea here is to make that data much more accessible to people. So instead of just having it, on PDFs that you produce or on paper maps that are printed, you can have that data in an interactive format that people can access at any time. It can be real time, so that as new locations are added, as field conditions change, as new sample results are analyzed, all of that information can be updated, and people can have that updated information so that they know they're working with the most up-to-date information available. So web maps, first off, is just kind of the most direct way for people who are not GIS specialists, who are not, say, CAD designers, to have direct information or direct access to their location data. So they can browse around a map, they can zoom in as they want, they can turn on and off layers, they can see underlying information about features. So as mentioned, you might click on, it's one thing to see the location of a well or see the location of a soil boring, but it's another to click on that well and say, well, I see this well was last sampled in June, and it has a screen interval of 2 to 12 feet. And that gives us a lot more in-depth information, as well as any other information you want to embed with that. Say you can actually have those sample results embedded in that too. So they can say, I see it was, sampled for benzene or whatever it may be. it just puts a lot more information in the hands of your designers so that they can work faster and they can work with better information so that hopefully their plans that they produce are better quality. Next, there are dashboards that are available. And these dashboards, their main purpose is to analyze real-time information and to see it in very kind of easy to digest formats, where you might have a bunch of field teams spread across an area. We have an excellent example of a project that was an airborne plume, and so it covers a very large area of a lot of residential areas. You have a lot of field teams working on that site, and so with the use of mobile devices, not only is that much more powerful and easier for the field teams to use with mobile devices than it is with paper devices, but you in the office can actually keep track of the work that's being done. That improves safety and that improves efficiency. If some occurrence happens, you can immediately say, oh, well, I see this field is the closest to that, as opposed to having to call various people, try and figure out where they are. You can track how many tasks that day have already been completed. See if maybe there's some incident that's holding up one team. You can divert another team to help that team based on location, once again, based on workloads. It just gives you a lot more information to really manage your teams effectively and manage your work effectively. Then, and these are just some of the examples of WebGIS and geospatial tools that can, put more power in the hands of your users. Story maps are a great way to really present a polished interactive presentation. Great for presenting to clients or stakeholders because they can have a lot of spatial information embedded in them, but they have a very slideshow presentation quality to them where they're very user-friendly, they're very interactive, they have a lot of nice visuals, and so they're a great way to not only present, but present in an interactive way where people can, your viewer, I want to see more about that. They're not just looking at a slide, they're looking at an interactive map so they can zoom in and click on a specific location for more information about that location. And last, there's a lot of options for interactive charts and visuals. So think of things like Power BI, things like Tableau, and Esri has their own version of that called Insights. And the main power of these tools is that they turn data into information. And by that I mean that you take information, or you take a lot of data, and a lot of us, once again, are sitting on mountains of data, but in and of itself, it doesn't have a lot of value. Turning data into information is turning it into actionable data. It's turning it into, there's a reason they named it Insights, is that you can look at this data and you can immediately start seeing trends. And they're very interactive as well, so you can click on a location in one visual, and all the other visuals change accordingly. So it's a great way to explore your site, a great way to explore your data, a great way to really build up a much more accurate and representative kind of mental picture of your site or the specific area that you're focusing on, and what you have to work with there. And last, one of the cool things about this technology is that it's made it a lot easier to collaborate across space and discipline. And obviously this is especially important with a lot of people these days working in remote locations, but even just beyond the remote idea, you're making it easier for people across disciplines to collaborate. So an example from one of our sites is that, a pretty large site, we have to come up with groundwater contours pretty customarily. Normally might have a hydrogeologist kind of looking over, and you present them a map, they maybe mark up that map either on paper or PDF, they send it back to you, you mark it up, you send it back to them, and it's kind of a time-consuming and labor-intensive process, a lot of back and forth. What these interactive web maps allow you to do is that you can give them direct access to the contours that you generate. So instead of them marking up a paper map or a PDF and then you doing the same thing in your software, they can just interact with the features directly. So in that top animation, you can see kind of an example of what, say, slight edits to a groundwater contour might look like. It's pretty user-friendly, and once again, they're accessing their real data so that they can see the underlying information as well. They want to see a nearby well, they want to see underlying information about it, and you don't have to produce different maps for different extents. If you have a very large area you're covering, you can still just make one map because these web maps allow people to just zoom into whatever area they're interested in and see the underlying information. And so it really brings a lot more people together and allows people to collaborate more seamlessly. In that bottom animation, you see, how easy it is to just add a sample location or update attributes as things maybe change in the field. When was this last sampled? What's the screen interval of this well? All that can be added from these web interfaces that are accessible to basically whoever you grant permission to. And it really goes a long way to, say, democratizing your geospatial data. So it's no longer just locked up by individuals. It's accessible to everyone. And not only is it accessible, but it can be edited and you can add value to your existing data by bringing more people into the fold. And last, just the idea of bringing it all together. So each of these technologies I mentioned have intrinsic value in and of themselves, but the real value comes in when you bring all of these solutions together, basically creating a holistic solution that's more than the simple sum of its parts. So, having drone as data collector, that's great, but if you don't have any way to analyze the data that the drone survey produces, it really limits its value somewhat, as opposed to if you really build out a full system where you have people collecting accurate location data, you have drones that are enriching that data and providing more information, you have systems in place to allow you to analyze that and really model it in 2 and 3D perspectives, and then you have an effective way to share that information with your users, with clients, with regulators. It forms a whole location information system that can add a lot of value, can increase safety, and really just make all of your lives easier as you go about your work. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions any of you may have.
Thank you. So everybody, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either ask your question via the Q&A tab on the WebEx. Please type your question and click send to all panelists. Or if you prefer to ask an audio question, please key star then 1 on your telephone, record your name, and then press the hash or the pound key. Please make sure your line's not muted. Thank you.
Sue, I think we have some questions on the Q&A. If you could check those over.
Certainly. So your first question asks, what are typical Z accuracy for drone-derived topo?
So the accuracy of your drone-derived topographic contours, or basically elevation information, it really depends on the equipment that you're using and the process that you use to do your survey. So kind of just go over it really quickly. If you take out, a traditional, the drones that we use, and you fly a grid pattern, you collect a lot of information or a lot of photos that you then stitch together into a model, that will be relatively accurate relative to itself. But the GPS in your drone, typical drone, is not very accurate. It's kind of similar to the one on your phone. It might be off by, say, 5 meters, which in our industry is a lot. So what you want to traditionally do is set up ground control points that you can use to tie down your survey. And using those, you can actually get very high levels of accuracy, up to, say, 0.15 feet vertically, and even better on the horizontal. And at that point, it really depends on the accuracy of your ground control points. And that's where that ties back into the use of high accuracy GPS devices. So ideally, you'd want to either already have existing, or even better, have a survey grade GPS unit that you either own or rent. You go out, you set up your ground control points to make them visible from the photos. And then in the post-processing that you do with the drone imagery, you select those points and kind of, as I said, it kind of stretches and anchors the whole model together. And then you can get very high levels of accuracy with your drone surveys. And there are other options as well, certainly using things like LiDAR. You can equip your drone with much more higher accuracy GPS units so that the photos that the drone takes have much more accurate coordinates with them. But you have various options like that. But yeah, I find the most traditional one is to use photogrammetry with ground control points.
Thank you. And your next question asks, what is the future of implementing drones at DoD facilities?
So that gets into a sticky question, of course, of what drone you're using and how you're going to be handling the data. So the DoD generally, unless this changes, has restricted the use of overseas drones. And as anyone in the drone field knows, about 70–80% of the market is dominated by DJI, which is a Chinese company. So perfectly feasible for most projects, but for DoD facilities, you have to look elsewhere. There are a bunch of domestic suppliers, generally more expensive, but that's what you have to do basically if you want to do work on a DoD facility. In terms of once you have a domestic derived or domestic manufactured drone, then you just have to work with the DoD to get approvals for data you're collecting, how that data is going to be handled. I've supported proposals for DoD facilities. It really boils down much more to the sensitivity of that specific facility. You know, are you doing, say, a landfill survey on that facility, which is, you know, not terribly sensitive, or are you doing something that's much more sensitive? So it really boils down to the individual facilities at that point. And you certainly can reach out to us if you have more questions about that. We have some people who work in that field who could give you more precise answers on that. But it really boils down to the individual sites.
Thank you. And your next question is, how is drone imagery and elevation data stored in a GIS? And is it cloud-based accessible? And can it be overlain with other GIS layers?
Yes, yes, and yes, basically. Yes to all of the above. So if I jump back in one moment here. So this video, this is based on a cloud. So one of the nice things about this is that you have your drone imagery, you have your drone model, and you have your elevation grid, in this case, you know, an elevation raster, and all of that's accessible on the cloud so that, you know, you can have people view it. This is all done in a web browser. So this is not, you know, some specific software that no one can access. It makes it much easier to share your results with your client or with your planners. But all of this is absolutely digestible in GIS as well. So you can bring the, we did a survey of one of the sites I work at in 2017, a site-wide survey, and we still to this day use the aerial imagery of that site. It's a very large site, and a lot of changes that happened since the previous airplane survey had been done, you know, 5–6 years before. And we were able to produce much higher resolution than that previous survey for a fraction of the cost to get, you know, high resolution aerial imagery that we use on all of our GIS figures. And you can do analysis with it as well. So with the elevation raster or something like that, if you have sample locations or specific features you want to know the elevation of that are on the surface, you can extract the elevation values from the location or from the elevation model and pair it with those features based on location. So yeah, basically all of the outputs of a drone survey are directly usable in GIS.
Thank you. Some clients have restrictions on use of drones manufactured in China. Are Parsons drones able to be used at such sites?
Yeah, so we use, a lot of our sites use the DJI drones because there's kind of a reason that they dominate the market. They produce well-made, cost-effective drones. But we've, as I said, we've supported proposals on DoD sites for using U.S.-based drones. You can also get, you know, if you're looking at LiDAR or something like that, you can get LiDAR that's produced entirely in the U.S. using software developed in the U.S. So the answer to that is yes. Parsons can support drone surveys at DoD sites. As I said, there are specifics to each DoD site. You might work, maybe if it's a base you're looking at, you may want to work with the base commander to make sure that, you know, you can get approvals to fly the area that you're flying, to get their approval for how you're going to store your data once you collect it, how you're going to deliver it to them, and then what's going to happen to the data that you collected after you delivered the products to them. So those are all pretty standard concerns, but obviously take a new level when you're working on DoD sites. But yeah, Parsons can support surveys on DoD sites.
Thank you. Your next question asks, what was the 3D software demonstrated in the presentation? Is it available in Parsons Astra?
Yes, that's these were produced by my coworker Chris O'Neill. I'm going to you can reach out to one of us after the presentation for the specific software. But yeah, it's Parsons software, and there's multiple softwares that you can choose from. You can do some of subsurface modeling in GIS, increasingly so. It's something that they're adding capabilities every year. But this specifically was created in, I don't remember the name of the software off the top of my head that he specifically used for this model. But if you reach out to one of us, either my email, I'll get you that information.
Thank you. What software platforms are being discussed and presented here, both for the total system and the phone-based forms?
So it's a combination of providers here. You have some things, you have a few different options when it comes to drone processing software for processing the imagery and also for collecting or flying the actual drone flight. When it comes to collecting data, you might have Esri on mobile forms. You also, we make use of Forms on Fire. It's a pretty great platform for a lot of our uses of digitizing forms and making very interactive forms that upload directly to our databases. And then, of course, a lot of Esri products as well. Being a GIS person, I'm partial to a lot of Esri software. We have an enterprise system here at Parsons, and also ArcGIS Online and various other platforms and software packages provided by Esri. And then when it comes to hardware for drones, as I said, DJI, we have some others as well. So it really runs the gambit of various different software and hardware providers.
Thank you. Your next question asks, just to have an idea of the cost, about how much will it cost the drone to fly, for example, that you share with us for 20 minutes fly over the site?
I'm hesitant to give a specific number only because it matters so much on the accuracy that you need for that survey, and also, of course, just limitations on safety accessing the site. Some sites require a decent amount of training ahead of time. But generally, I mean, you can kind of do the estimates yourself based on just an idea of, you might have 24, 32 hours, of labor for flying the site and processing the data afterwards. So compared to a traditional, I can tell you that compared to a traditional terrestrial survey, the cost often comes out to at least half, if not less.
Thank you. What is the typical accuracy you have observed in your topographic surveys?
Assuming that they mean from drone surveys, as I said, I just flew a site in March where we got the root mean square error below 1.15 feet vertical, which is well under the requirements that they need for that site. That's a pretty high level of accuracy. Not that you can't get higher, but that's a pretty high level using ground control points, just kind of a normal mapping grade drone. You can get higher, certainly, if you start looking at things like LiDAR, but it is difficult to get much higher than that. You can certainly, for reduced cost, you can get less than that. You can get, 0.5 foot vertical accuracy, because some sites, they don't necessarily, if you're not using it for design, if you're using it to get a good, I use the word like situational awareness again, like of your site, if you're planning a new site, you kind of want, and in a lot of sites, their main ask is updated aerial imagery because they want to use it on all their figures. They want to see, the most up to date of like what's present on the site, when they're doing plans. But the accuracy generally somewhere between, let's say somewhere between like 0.1 and 0.2 foot vertical, if you're going for high levels of accuracy, and, we can work with you to get less as needed, but that's generally what I've seen.
Thank you. Your next question asks, how do you convince or induce a die-hard paper and pen person to embrace using a web map? Some people are not as tech literate and may feel intimidated or out of their depth even though the maps are made to be user-friendly.
Yeah, so you always have your early adopters and you always have your laggards when it comes to introducing new software and new capabilities to your, whether it's your field teams or whether it's your design teams in the office. We've gotten surprisingly positive feedback from our field and technical teams. Even the people who are not the most tech savvy or are not necessarily the ones to jump in head first into the stuff, there's often a real hunger for this information where traditionally they're kind of looking over and over for new paper maps. And if you can really, I find that you have to kind of meet them where they are. So, you know, for your difficult, it's always helpful to identify the early adopters because they can help be your champions to getting, you know, teams to really give the new, you know, software a chance. But it's also important to kind of not look at them as adversaries so much as it is people you want to work with. So you work with them to figure out what are their pain points, what are their problems that they deal with their traditional work. And then if you can really you know, sit down with them, show that you're listening, and come up with solutions using this new or using these new innovations to address those specific pain points that they're experiencing, those same people can often end up being your strongest proponents because you specifically work with them to address their specific needs. But and when it comes to the technical aspect of it, I'd say there's different options when it comes to web mapping and mobile apps. Some are easier to use than others. They're all pretty user-friendly, but some definitely more so than others. So it's probably helpful to start off with the easier-to-use things. So whether it be, you know, a mobile app like that just kind of allows them to browse the map very easily in the same way one might use Google Maps. That can be a good entry point. Or maybe a simple, you can produce web maps that are very interactive, but you can also produce web apps that are a little bit more polished and have a little bit more, the options that they have to interact with are kind of more clearly pronounced. So just things like, oh, here's a search bar. I type in a sample, I type in, you know, S235. Oh, there it is. It zoomed me right to it, you know, and it's just, you can kind of start them with the easier and kind of more intuitive apps and maps and kind of get them, kind of use that as your bait to kind of get them more interested in what else you have to offer.
Thank you. And the final question we have at the moment. Hi, Tim. Are there programs you can recommend that PMs, coordinators, can request from Parsons to start working with spatial data and create basic drawings? Currently, in my office, only draftspeople and GIS specialists have this ability.
Sorry, could you read the first half of the question again?
Are there programs you can recommend that PMs, coordinators can request from Parsons to start working with spatial data and create basic drawings?
Oh, okay. So kind of asking what can okay, so if the question is like what can non-GIS or non-CAD people, what kind of programs can they use to produce basic drawings, to produce, and just really to interact with a lot of the maps that you use. Here at Parsons, we created the whole system that we call ParMap together, which uses a combination of software from different providers to provide our solutions. But using, you know, web maps and things of that nature, some of the Esri tools that are available can really help to, oftentimes you want to have a GIS specialist set up the map or set up the data for you. And that's where, you know, it's not that you're replacing GIS specialists altogether, but I use the term from gatekeepers to curators. So it's not that, you know, you just kind of get into the raw data and pull things out and do everything from scratch because that's kind of intensive. But instead of having to go to a GIS specialist or a CAD person for every individual need you have, they can now set up, say, a web map, a web app, a mobile app for you that you can then interact with. And once that's set up, once those layers are available, And there's a lot of under the hood stuff, so I don't want to like make it sound like this is 2 seconds and you're done. But as they set that up, you can actually have that live information, or live sync to the data set, so you're working with the most up-to-date information, all available. So you can add it. You can have a web map set up. You can add additional layers as you want. You can turn them on and off. You can change the symbology. You can add labels. You can print, and using that map or that app, you can then print whatever extents that you're interested in if you do want a paper map, or you can access it from a mobile device from the field. So there's a lot that you can do as a project manager, as a project scientist, a geologist, someone who's not a GIS or CAD specific person, to create your own kind of maps to fit your custom needs. But there's a lot to be said for having a GIS specialist help you set that up, to help publish those layers, to make them available to you, to help maybe set up some initial symbologies so that they're very intuitive. As soon as you add them to your map, you're like, oh, I see, this is symbol. I recognize that symbol for monitoring well, or whatever it may be. You have your utilities color coordinated, so that most people associate the red with electric lines or things of that nature. So you can work with them to set it up. The power really comes in that once they set it up for you, you have then really kind of like a sandbox that you can then play in and do a lot with.
Tim, I'm going to have to cut it off there. We're about out of time. Appreciate the presentation, and for those who still have questions, invite you to get a hold of Tim directly, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to continue discussing. A couple of things I did want to mention. We did have one of our folks that offered up the fact that the 3D software we were talking about earlier was called CTech, so if that helps answer one of the questions someone was asking. CTech, C-T-E-C-H. The other thing I wanted to mention is our next webinar in this series is May 27th, 2 weeks from today. We will have Juan Espinoza, and he's going to be talking about a little bit of an unusual topic for us on these in this series, but it's going to be covering industrial cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. So I think that will be very interesting for a lot of us, and invite everybody to join. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that this webinar today was approved for PDH hours. So if that is something you're interested in, you can respond to the email announcement that you got for this webinar, and I can get you a sign-in sheet, and we can get the certificate processed for the PDHs. Tim, great presentation. I really appreciate your time and the effort that you put into this. And with that, we will close the webinar out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, everyone, for joining. That concludes your call. Please disconnect and have a good day.